Following is a special presentation of Ed's Sports Channel. Welcome, sports fans, to this NBA Draft Wrap-Up Special. In this show, I'm going to go over every selection by the Pistons. I'm going to go over all their draft day trades, including the one that they made today. And then in the next segment, I will go over their entire roster. Finally, I will share with you my thoughts as to what I think they're going to do with the roster. This first segment, I'm going to talk about the Pistons draft day selections. Pistons had 3 first-round draft selections. With their own, at number 7, they selected Killian Hayes, point guard from France. With the 16th selection, they selected Isaiah Stewart, center from Washington. The 19th selection, they selected Saddiq Bey, a power forward from Villanova. And then with the second round selection that they got in a trade, they selected Saben Lee, point guard from Vanderbilt. Now, I've already gone over on the draft day what I thought about each of these players from my research. So if you want to listen to that, that's where it would be found within the draft day summary. Or I'm sorry, not the draft day summary, but after each selection by the Pistons. However, I will do a collective summary at the end about what I think this team is going to be like. Pistons made 3 trades to get the last 3 selections that I was speaking of, as they did not have a second round selection of their own. They traded their first round selection for what turned out to be Isaiah Stewart to the Rockets, plus they got $4.1 million. So they got Trevor Ariza, Isaiah Stewart, and $4.1 million, and gave the Rockets a future first round selection and their second round selection that they got from the Lakers next year. To get Saddiq Bey, they made a trade with the Clippers, which was a 3-way trade with the Nets. They got Rodney Magruder from the Clippers, and the 19th selection turned out to be Saddiq Bey, and they gave the Clippers Luke Kennard. The Nets got, I forgot who it was, but I mentioned on the draft day special, the one player from the Clippers. To get Saben Lee, they made a trade with the Jazz, where they gave up a future draft selection in cash. And then today's trade, they traded shooting guard, Kyrie Thomas and small forward Tony Snell to the Hawks for center Dwayne Dedmon. Okay, so now that we know what they've done and that there's been a flurry of activity under their new general manager, what does all this essentially mean? And what do I think of these players? Well, what it essentially means, I will get to in the final segment. But from what I remember, Killian Hayes is a young player who's very talented. He has trouble shooting with his right hand. He's primarily a left-handed shooter. Not a surprise he's going to have to learn better balance, which he's already been working on, by the way. Another problem he has is he turns the ball over too much, but the Pistons have tended to turn the ball over a lot as a team, so that's definitely an area of improvement for him. He doesn't get to the free throw line too much, which, again, as a guard is okay. I mean, I would prefer for a lottery selection that high that he be a little bit better at drawing fouls. But the one thing that concerns me is his defense is kind of spotty. Pistons need good defenders, especially right now, especially if they're rebuilding, because when you rebuild, presumptively you're rebuilding towards a championship. And that was going to be my concern about him anyway, being an international player, that their defense tends not to be that good. So a lot of area of improvement for him on that. And where he fits in the Pistons, again, I'll get to that in the next segment. In terms of Isaiah Stewart, He's a big man who has trouble guarding, defending away from the rim, which is not surprising. That's something that will take time for him to learn. But other than that, the only thing I'll say about him is his scoring average in college was a little bit below what I would expect. So I don't think he's going to be a great scoring center. He may be adequate. We'll see. For being 16th, I would hope he'd be a little bit better than adequate, but again, we'll see. In terms of Saddiq Bey, it's going to be really interesting because I know what the Wildcats have been. And I think he probably will be the one with perhaps, although hopefully not, because you hope Killian Hayes is the one with the greatest upside. But I wouldn't be surprised if Saddiq Bey did have the greatest upside. He's a pretty good scorer, and I believe will need to work on his shooting, his three-point shooting, which is not surprising. And I would say playing at Villanova, from what I can tell, his defense is probably better than the other two that I've mentioned. So that'll be interesting to see. And then Saben Lee was the 8th selection in the second round. Commodores haven't been a good basketball team typically for a while, but I believe they were the last year or two. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about what's been going on in their program other than that. But to get a point guard, I mean, that's certainly an area of need for the Pistons, and they certainly doubled up on that with Saben Lee after drafting Killian Hayes, presumably because of Derrick Rose's future. And again, I'll get to that later on. I would imagine they're thinking that Saben Lee will be coming off the bench and playing who knows how many minutes per game. I'd say to start out with, conservatively, let's say 10, and going from there. Also within this, they got, and I don't want to forget about this, they got Trevor Ariza. Trevor Ariza may very well be released, though. Although I hope they keep him. If they keep him, I could see him being the starting power forward. They also got Rodney Magruder, which will be interesting. And I'll get to that later on as to where I think he'll fit in. And then the rest of it was not players that they got or gave up, other than Luke Kennard. I was a little dismayed to see them let Luke Kennard go. And then before draft day, they made the trade that I mentioned, where they traded Bruce Brown to the Nets for, and I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly. Again, I have to learn it. Dzanan Musa, who is a power forward. However, he's young. Again, international player, though, so I kind of wonder about his defense, but we'll see what happens with that. If you haven't been able to tell by now, the Pistons have turned over more than half the roster, and I suspect they're not done quite yet. I think they have a few more moves to make. Whether or not they'll make them before the start of the regular season remains to be seen. Again, I will get to that later on, but that pretty much sums up their draft. As to what I think about it, unlike the NFL draft, I'm not going to grade this one because I'm really not familiar with any of these players. But I will say this, if 2 of the 3 first-round selections pan out, I'll be very pleased. The problem I have with it is the one I'm the most concerned about not panning out is their first one, and that's Killian Hayes. I don't know why. I just don't have a good feeling about him. And I just don't have a good feeling like he's going to pan out. I also think there's going to be a lot of pressure on him. Perhaps not just from France, but I'm thinking from the fans. He is the highest drafted guard, I believe, by the Pistons since Isaiah Thomas. And I don't think he's going to be the next Isaiah Thomas. And the problem is that there's a prominent point guard from France who's probably the best player in French history, basketball-wise, and that's Tony Parker. And he was a second-round selection, I believe, or a late first-round selection. And I'd be shocked if Killian Hayes wound up being anything close to him. Obviously, I would want Killian Hayes to be the best player he could be, but for where he's selected, he needs to be a star and conceivably the leader of the team. And for whatever reason, I just don't see that being the case with the Pistons. And I can't tell you why other than gut feeling. As far as Saben Lee, I think he was selected high enough. He'll have a good shot at panning out, at least for a while. But do bear in mind that, from what ESPN said last night, that only 28% of the second round selections ever do really make it, and a lot of them are deep bench players. And it used to be where second round selections were only about 2 or 3 out of the entire draft. That's why, for those of you who remember, Dennis Rodman would be a great example of that for the Pistons. And then somebody like Mark Price would be another good example. But you cannot think of too many, certainly in the 80s or probably even the 90s, who were second round selections that panned out. Even a lot of the time, you have it where a third of the first round selections don't pan out, either due to injury or otherwise. So while I'm hoping Saben Lee will be good, if he's adequate, being a second round selection, that'll be fine, especially being a high second round selection. If he can play 10-15 minutes a game, give the Pistons some quality points and quality minutes and play defense, I'll be very satisfied with that. And then we'll see what happens with them netting Trevor Ariza, Rodney Magruder. And I want to talk a little bit about Dwayne Dedmon. I'm surprised the Pistons made that trade, trading Kyrie Thomas and Tony Snell. They traded 2 young players to the Hawks for a veteran. Now, Tony Snell is about Dwayne Dedmon's age, but certainly Kyrie Thomas, they just drafted him a couple of years ago, and now the Hawks have gotten a little younger, I would say, while the Pistons have an unknown center that I'm assuming he'll start, with Isaiah Washington learning from him. And then Thon Maker will probably get his standard minutes, I'm thinking. But a better question is, was this trade really necessary right now? I know there were rumors that Tony Snell was going to be traded before he left. And perhaps it was wise of the Pistons for that reason to trade him for that reason. But he was a heck of a player for the Pistons. And sometimes he'd come in and get 10, 12 quick points for him. I'm sad to see him go, just like I'm sad to see Luke Kennard go. But again, we'll see how all these trades pan out, for sure. In the next segment, I'm going to go over the Pistons roster, player by player. And then in the final segment, I will talk about the changes, or the further changes, that the Pistons, I think, ought to make, or may very well make. Stay tuned to the N.B.A. Draft Wrap-Up Special on Ed's Sports Channel.